Didit Kate Mila Falcha. Welcome to Irish Granny Tarot. Welcome to my returning subscribers, because you know what day it is. It's Saturday. Oh, and welcome to my new subscribers, because it's still Saturday for you too. On Saturdays, I usually cover a book, and I have a book that looks like it's going to be fun. It had a few little moments of philosophizing, but for the most part, it's lighthearted. I hope I do justice to the author, and I can never say her name. Barbara Ehrenreich. Natural Causes, an epidemic of wellness, the certainty of dying, and killing ourselves to live longer. So I hope you enjoy this book, and I'm just going to jump right into it. So she, as a teenager, aspired to be a scientist and actually has a PhD, I think. She did research in a variety of different labs, and I should probably have known this. Yes, she has a PhD in cellular immunology from Rockefeller University. Has won the Erasmus Prize for her work as an investigative journalist. She's written a whole lot of books, and she's really, really funny. As I said, I hope I do her justice. And what I liked about this book is she wrote it in 2018, so it's pretty recent, but right before the pandemic. And I wonder how that would have changed some of her beliefs in this book, especially when she starts talking about viruses. So, as a teen, she wanted to be a scientist, but she wasn't willing to spend her whole entire life in a lab, and therefore she decided to read and write about science. And in that process, at some point, she read an article in Scientific American and said it was just deeply upsetting, because the topic was that the immune system actually contributes to the growth and spread of tumors. And she said that it struck her as being the equivalent of a fire department being staffed by arsonists. We've always depended on our immune systems to protect us, and all this new research is coming up with a whole different take on the immune system. It's openly acknowledged by science to be paradoxical. And in this book, because she has a scientific bent, she's able to address a lot of these issues from that point of view, and yet it's a bit of a philosophical book at the same time. That's what I liked about it. She said that this whole situation with the immune system is a new scientific puzzle with deep moral reverberations. We're urged to strengthen our immune system, think positive thoughts, because the immune system connects the conscious and the unconscious. And she does do a deep dive in this book into the wellness industry, and she has a very, very jaundiced view of all of it, and it's hilarious. She said you might be better to just go ahead and think your negative thoughts. Don't worry about it. Think negative thoughts and take immunosuppressants at the same time. Oh, and as a caveat, I should tell you that she had breast cancer and underwent surgery for that, and radiation and chemotherapy. I think both, or at least one. And so she knows of which she speaks. And if at times this book seems to make light of certain things, and she does talk a little bit about vaccinations, this is way before the pandemic. She talks about a lot of things that might challenge people's assumptions about medical care. I found them hilarious, so we'll see. She says that in the middle of the 20th century, the immune system was considered sort of a surveillance system for the body. And now, today, we realize that immune cells can often give cancer cells a pass and not fight them. And she took this personally, she said, because she had cancer in 2000, breast cancer. And she did graduate work in college on macrophages. And macrophages are frontline defenders. They eat microbes, and they're kind of like amoeba inside your body. They are these little one-celled, not organisms, but things that wander around and surround and engulf and destroy foes of your body, threats, also debris. They're kind of an all-purpose garbage control system. But frontline defense, they're sent by the body to take care of the problem. And as a graduate student, she'd seen the healthcare system turn into a gigantic industry and really began to ask herself, as part of the system, trying to look at it objectively, what does it really have to offer us? It promises health and longevity, and it offers us control over our bodies. And that's what we're always seeking. We're seeking control with diet and surgery and exercise. And we try to control our emotions so that we don't upset the balance of our system. And then we exercise our brains with games. And we're always trying to stave off deterioration or infection or age. But she says not everything is within our control. And our body is not a smoothly running machine. It's a confederation of parts, and each of these parts has its own agenda. And they're really not concerned about whether or not their agenda endangers the whole. And this is something relatively new in scientific discoveries, and this is really difficult for people to accept. It's a new way of looking at what's going on inside of us. Many cells in the body, they have discovered, are capable of cellular decision making, and it's almost like free will for the cells. They're capable of making bad choices. So the first half of the book is about our quest for control, medical care, lifestyle, the wellness industry, and it's pretty snarky. And she finally concludes that there are limits to human control and how much of our biology is really susceptible to our conscious control anyway. It can be harmonious or it can be in perpetual conflict, and a lot of what we do doesn't seem to really matter much to our misconception at the moment. It's beginning to occur to science. This is like emerging science, new discoveries, that the body's a sort of a dystopian site of ongoing conflict at a cellular level. That there's just all sorts of stuff going on inside of you that you probably don't want to know about. And the book concludes with the idea that it's perhaps time to rethink just how much control we actually have and just how much blame we actually bear for what happens to our bodies. She says you can think of death bitterly or with resignation as a tragic interruption of your life, and you can take every possible measure to postpone it. Or more realistically, you can think of life as an interruption of an eternity of personal non-existence, and sees it as a brief opportunity to observe and interact with the living, ever-surprising world around us. And I have the impression, although she doesn't really come out and say it, that she has a very sort of obviously scientific view of life. I'm not quite sure the terminology to use here. She's not given to, she doesn't say that she's an atheist. She doesn't say that she doesn't believe in an afterlife. She doesn't say that she has no spiritual point of view. And she doesn't carefully avoid talking about it either. But she is quite snarky and critical of people who unquestioningly make assumptions about a lot of what she calls woo-woo stuff. And it doesn't bother me to have my belief systems questioned or have maybe insinuations made that, maybe I'm a little out there. That doesn't bother me a bit. So I would just warn everybody that there may be a few things that she says that, get you feeling a little bit defensive. Don't worry about it. It's one person's opinion, and I'm not advocating and I'm not arguing against it either. I'm just saying this is the book, and it's a funny book, and it makes you think, and that's the important thing. So, chapter 1, midlife revolt. She said in the past few years, she had decided to give up on a whole lot of measures, medical things that just seemed pro forma. They seemed like we're expected to do them. Everybody expects you to do them. You do them. You don't even question the necessity of them. Things like cancer screening. Keep in mind she's had cancer. Cancer screenings, annual physicals, pap smears. And she said, she's not suicidal. She wasn't trying to injure herself. She said it was more like a gradual accumulation of micro decisions. She'd make an appointment and have to change it, and never getting around to rescheduling it. And then 3 months would go by, and then a year would go by, and then finally she just gave up on it. She slowly began to go against her own biases, her own scientific biases, in favor of preventative medicine and preventative care, and sort of make decisions based on the aggravation and the ridiculous cost of everything. She went against her demographic. All of her friends are very pro preventative stuff. They were always ratcheting up the diet and the yoga and the testing, and there's kind of this atmosphere that good health is sort of virtuous, and maintaining good health is a virtuous thing to do. And the example she gives is the way we talk about food. It's sinfully delicious, or it's guilt-free, and people go on purges and fasts and take these punitive measures to atone for lapses in their diet, and it's a whole sort of a religious penance attitude towards food, a reward and punishment system. And she realized, I look at the obituaries these days, and people younger than I am are dying on a regular basis. And she says, I realized I was old enough to die. The reality of it hit her. I always say I've gotten to an age where no one's going to say, isn't it a pity she died so young? Anyway, she said the obituaries show people of her age, and it's an age that nobody really needs an explanation in the obituary. It'll just say, oh, they died of natural causes, and you go, well, yeah, whatever that age was, of course they died of natural causes. No, oh, tragic, what happened? None of that. So she decided that she was no longer she was old enough to no longer have to suffer the pursuit of a longer life. The writing was on the proverbial wall. So how does not going looking for problems affect you? She said, well, why would I go look for problems if they're not even detectable to me? Why am I searching it out? Now, a little side story. My mother-in-law used to say, I'm not going to the doctor. You go to the doctor, they'll find something wrong with you. And she lived to be quite elderly. I think she was in her 90s, very late 80s anyway. And she was right. She was right. I used to think that was terrible. I worked in the health field. Her son worked in the health field, and I used to just be horrified that anybody would be so cavalier about their health. And then now that I'm older, I agree with her. So the question that she asked herself, that she says perhaps more people ought to ask themselves, is how do you really want to spend your remaining time? Sitting in the doctor's office, having tests, worrying and waiting for results? she's always been the kind of person to question medical authority. But she says, but I am not uncooperative. Uh, for example, the doctor told her, well, oh, how old are you? Well, it's time for you to have a bone density scan. And so she said, well, why? And the doctor said, well, there's a drug that you could take if it turns out to have a certain loss of density. And she knew, because she's a scientist to begin with, she knew about all these side effects of this drug. And he said, well, it's a better alternative to risk the side effects than it is to risk a fracture and end up going into a nursing home and then going into a descent. And I guess nowadays, too, with COVID. So she said, well, okay, kind of reluctantly, she had the scan, and the diagnosis was osteopenia. And this is your bones thinning out. And almost every woman over the age of 35 has this, because your bone density is related to calcium metabolism, which is related to hormones. And it's sort of a function of getting older and your hormones fluctuating. It's not a disease. It's a normal feature of aging. And so she had this moral decision to make. It's a normal feature of aging, but there are things to do to offset that from happening. But then that causes their own domino effect, cascade of problems that, like she said in the book, you often see people taking a pill for one condition and then taking 2 pills for the side effects, and then 3, and the next thing you know, they're taking 15 pills a day. So she decided to do a little investigating, and she asked who's pushing the research, who did the research for bone scans, who's pushing this. The drug manufacturer of the drug that they give you when they tell you that your bones are losing density is the only source of information about having to have a bone scan. And she did find out later, too, that the drugs, not only did they have side effects, they actually made the bone density issue worse. So it could be argued that preventative medicine exists to transform people into the raw material for a profit-hungry medical industry complex, medical industrial complex. So then the issue came up of mammograms. That's the old bugaboo, mammograms. And she had, like I said, breast cancer, so she was particularly in tune with this. So my first major defection from the required screening regimen was precipitated by a mammogram. No one likes mammography, which amounts to a brute force effort to render the breasts transparent. First, a breast is flattened between 2 plates, then it's bombarded with ionizing radiation, which is, incidentally, the only environmental factor known for sure to cause breast cancer. I'd been fairly dutiful about mammograms since having been treated for breast cancer at the turn of the millennium, and now, about 10 years later, the gynecologist's office reported that I'd had a bad mammogram. I spent the next few anxious weeks undergoing further tests, in the midst of which I managed to earn a ticket for distracted driving. Naturally, I was distracted by the looming decision of whether I would undergo debilitating cancer treatments again or just let the disease take its course this time. It turned out, after I'd been through a sonogram and fought panic in a coffin-like MRI tube, that the bad mammogram was a false positive resulting from the highly sensitive new digital forms of imaging. That was my last mammogram. Lest this seem like a reckless decision, I was supported in it by a high-end big city oncologist who viewed all my medical images and said that there would be no need to see me again, which I interpreted as ever again. So she said that she had achieved an age where every medical appointment she went to ended up in a struggle for more tests. She'd go to the dentist to get her teeth cleaned, and I went through this fight with my dentist. Wanted to do dental x-rays, and that's the standard of care. And when I said I don't want to be exposed to I was in a car accident. I've had a lot of those full head, dental x-rays. I mean, I can't even tell you how many. And I just don't want to have any more. And he said, well, then you can't be my patient. And it's a small town, and I'd already left the previous dentist for greed. He cut the hygienist's salary because he was building a fancy new office. I was disgusted, so I changed dentists. But anyway, it's political, making dentistry a political issue. So she got into this struggle with her dentist. Same argument I had, why would you do this? There's nothing wrong. I have no pain. Everything's fine. Well, it's the standard of care. And then she went to a doctor, and she had no signs and symptoms, and the doctor wanted to try this new lung capacity test that he'd just gotten, and for looking for pulmonary obstructions. And at that point, she drew her line in the sand. Then the dentist also wanted her to take a sleep apnea test. The big argument was, well, everyone needs to have a sleep apnea test because you could die in your sleep. And she told the dentist, well, that's a risk I'm willing to take. Then she resisted a colonoscopy, which I hesitate to say this, please take this the right way, the colonoscopy, the colonoscopy, which they push. Okay, so my internist, the chief physician in a mid-sized group practice, sent out a letter announcing that he was suspending his ordinary practice in order to offer a new level of concierge care for those willing to cough up an extra $1,500 a year beyond what they already paid for insurance. The elite care would include 24-hour access to the doctor, leisurely visits, and the letter promised all kinds of tests and screenings in addition to the routine ones. This is when my decision crystallized. I made an appointment and told him face to face that 1, I was dismayed by his willingness to drop his less than affluent patients, who appeared to make up much of the waiting room population, and then 2, I didn't want any more tests. I wanted a doctor who could protect me from unnecessary procedures. I would remain with the masses of ordinary, haphazardly screened patients. So, rather than being fearful of not detecting disease, both patients and doctors should fear health care. The best way to avoid medical errors is to avoid medical care. The default should be, I'm well. The way to stay that way is to keep making good choices, not to have my doctor look for problems. And then she talks about a medical meeting where someone reported that a 100-year-old woman had just had her first mammogram, causing the audience to break out in a loud cheer. I'm sorry. It really is ridiculous. So she says, with age, if you're watching this and you're young, you'd probably, think this is crazy. But with age, the cost-benefit ratio shifts dramatically, and your personal appetite for medical interaction wanes. Although that's not entirely true. For some people, they kind of develop a growing hypochondria because it's interaction, it's attention. If something is found that could require disfiguring surgery, radiation, a drastic lifestyle change, and add years, would that be a decision that you'd welcome? You might have years of a depleted, painful life. You might be disfigured. You might have to have treatments the rest of your life. People with one terminal disease are still urged to have a screening for other possible diseases. And the real reason, the reason why she wrote this book really is what's the motive, and the motive is profit. It's a good way to make money from healthy patients. You create an industry where you're spending healthcare dollars even when you're not sick. There's a problem finding something worthy of following, and so they do more and more tests, hoping that even if they don't find something, the cost of the test is income. How many islands surround Britain's coast? The answer, of course, depends on the resolution of the map you're using, as well as how you're defining an island. With high resolution technologies like CT scans, the detection of tiny abnormalities is almost inevitable, leading to ever more tests, prescriptions, and doctor's visits. And the tendency to overtest is amplified when the doctor who recommends the test has a financial interest in the screening or imaging facility that he or she refers people to. And that happens all the time. Patient advocacy groups really push screening, and diseases have spokespeople, colored ribbons, special days, to honor that, draw attention to that particular disorder. Even vocal defenders of discredited testing that's already shown to not really be valuable, to be a waste of money. Some people still support it. For example, doing regular mammograms for women under 50. Statistically, medically, statistically, they're not preventative. But they're defended by some doctors because they provide peace of mind. And she says, well, yeah, they provide peace of mind unless you get a false positive. And also, as what happened to one of my friends, you get a negative and they send it to the wrong place and you never hear back. Thyroid cancer is overdiagnosed all the time because they have extremely powerful imaging that can detect minuscule lumps, and they'll recommend a surgical removal of the lump even if they don't know whether it's cancerous or not. They just are aggressive about that. And 70 to 80% of thyroid cancer surgeries are not needed. Let me say that again. They have powerful machinery. They image tiny lumps. They go in. They want to, rather than go in and take a sample and look and see, is it, biopsy it to see if it's cancer or not. They'll just remove. They'll do the surgery and remove it, and oftentimes take the whole thyroid, because the thyroid secretes hormones that affect the whole body, and it can spread cancer. But of those surgeries that they do, up to 80% are unnecessary. That just blows your mind. I'll read this again. An estimated 70 to 80% of thyroid cancer surgeries performed on U.S., French, and Italian women in the first decade of the 21st century are now judged to have been unnecessary. In South Korea, where doctors were especially conscientious about thyroid screening, that number rose to 90%. Men were also overdiagnosed, but in far lower numbers. Patients pay a price for these surgeries, including a lifelong dependence on thyroid hormones, and since these are not always effective, the patient may be left feeling chronically depressed and sluggish. It's really difficult to replace naturally produced thyroid medication. Not much protest against this goes on in the medical field, but there is now more vocal objection to the medicalization of dying. And she says, in giving up on preventative care, I'm taking this line of thinking a little farther. Not only do I reject the torment of a medicalized death, but I refuse to accept a medicalized life. And my determination only deepens with age. As the time that remains to me shrinks, each month and day becomes too precious to spend in windowless waiting rooms under the cold scrutiny of machines. Being old enough to die is an achievement, not a defeat, and the freedom it brings is worth celebrating. So then she talks, chapter 2, rituals of humiliation. So for most young women, routine medical contact is usually involving reproduction. That's usually why healthy young women go to the doctor. Contraception, if you want contraception and you don't live in Texas, for example, a diaphragm, which is just a barrier. It's just a plastic barrier. And they tell you have to go in and have it fitted, and it's a prescription, and you have to have an exam and everything. And the reality is that the fit is affected by all sorts of things, gaining and losing weight, hormones, what you ate that day, water retention. Just there's a variety of different things that can affect it, so that it's never actually as accurate as they would like you to believe that it is, as effective a barrier as they would like you to think. And of course, then there's the whole issue of pregnancy and having to deal with that. And you don't want to get me started on this topic. This was my Joan of Arc moment, my entire middle of my life. And the way that birth is treated in America is unbelievable, but that's for another time. So she went to the doctor for her pregnancy exam. And when he put in the speculum and looked at her cervix, she asked him, was it beginning to dilate? Because she was close to the end of her pregnancy. The doctor looked at the nurse and said, where did a nice girl like this learn to talk like that? So the point being that women are encouraged to be removed from an understanding of what's going on down there. And they don't like a woman who's pregnant, who's proactive about what's going on with her. She says she was infuriated. She just received a PhD in cell biology. She said that was the moment she became a feminist. She just could not believe it. She said, to the nurse's credit, the nurse didn't say anything. She just gave her a look, in the following years, she never really questioned. She was cooperative, right? She never really questioned regular exams, pre and postnatal exams, well baby and well child care exams, and vaccinations. I'll digress one more time and then I'll stop. So I had a lot of kids. And when I was growing up, there were a lot of children in my family and absolutely no money. We never went to the doctor. Never. I mean, we never went to the doctor. And so that wasn't something that was in my cultural frame of reference. So when I had children, I had home births. And I did take them to get their vaccinations. And that was it. And one of my daughters was, middle school, and was going to go away to sports camp or Girl Scout camp or something, and she needed a physical. So I called the children's clinic and asked to make an appointment for her, and they said, well, is she a patient? And I said, yes, she's a patient, because she'd been there once when she was a newborn. And they said to me, well, we can't find her chart. And I said, well, she was there. Well, when was her last visit? 12 years ago. And they were horrified. They said, well, what about her annual well child checks? And I said, well, in our family, we don't go to the doctor unless we're sick. They were just horrified. I was afraid they were going to call CPS on me. Actually, I was really very amused at the strength of their horror. They're very much invested in the whole notion. And she's probably the healthiest of all of my children, too, I should say. So anyway, she said that she went to this doctor and she had a bad cold. And the doctor prescribed antibiotics. And she said, well, wait a minute. Isn't this just a bad cold? I mean, is this a bacteria? I thought colds were a virus. And the doctor says, I always prescribe antibiotics for a nervous mother. This must have been for her kid. For a nervous mother. And she was just horrified. She just said she scooped her child up and left. So a medical procedure with no demonstrable effect on a person is actually a ritual. And this gets very philosophical here. I think this is very interesting. So these rituals, these sort of medical rituals, are solemn ceremonies consisting of a series of actions that are performed according to a prescribed order. And they do have, perhaps not physical effect, but they have a psychological effect. And then the question is, do they really contribute to your well-being, or are they simply hardwired into the medical system to increase your sense of helplessness and dependence on the doctors? And this is sort of the basic theory that she came to after studying this and researching it. Western anthropologists found indigenous people worldwide performed supposedly health-giving rituals that had no basis in Western science, often involving drumming, dancing, chanting, the application of herbal concoctions, the manipulation of what appeared to be sacred objects like teeth and feathers. An anthropologist in the 80s offered a lengthy and loving detail of a ritual performed in Zambia. The afflicted person, whose symptoms included joint pain and extreme lassitude, is given a leaf infusion to drink, and then her back is repeatedly anointed with other herbal mixtures, cut with a razor blade and cupped with an animal horn, accompanied by drumming and singing, and a recital of grudges the patient holds against others in the village, until the source of the illness exits her body. Does this work? And so, yes, insofar as the affected person is usually restored to his or her usual strength and good humor, but there's no way to compare the efficacy of the ritual to the measure of Western physicians' way of treating, blood tests, imaging, and so on, because this Zambian ritual is not something accessible to scientific medicine. It's conceived as the tooth of a human hunter, which has made its way into the victim's body, where it bites and may even reproduce. Now, if this sounds fantastical, consider this that an agent of a disease, a hunter's tooth, is a lot easier for someone to visualize than a virus. And sometimes at the end of the ceremony, one of the officiants will even produce a human tooth, claiming to have extracted it from the victim's body. And of course, the opportunity to air long-held grudges may be therapeutic in itself, but the point being that the ritual may not have any rooted effect in science, but the person gets better. So what's going on? Ritual, the word ritual, is a pejorative. We give it a weight of not being valid because we don't associate ritual with healthcare. We don't label what we do ritual, but she's going to point out here that a lot of these things we do are merely rituals to give people a sense of well-being. There's no different than pretending to haul a tooth out of your body and having you air your grudges. So they inevitably drew a parallel between the healing rituals of supposedly primitive people and the procedures of modern Western medicine. The latter also take place in specially designated spaces, are performed by costumed personnel wearing white coats and masks. They manipulate objects generally unavailable to the public at large. And in 1956, a time of widespread reverence for the medical profession and its institutional settings, an anthropologist wrote a very funny article called Body Rituals Among the Nakarima. Nakarima is American, spelled backwards. And they described these medical rituals, starting with the hospital, which they referred to as a temple. Few supplicants, patients, in the temple are well enough to do anything but lie on their hard beds. The daily ceremonies, like the rites of the holy mouthmen, the dentists, involve discomfort and torture. With ritual precision, the Vestals awaken their miserable charges each dawn and roll them about on their beds of pain while performing ablutions in the formal movements of which the maidens are highly trained. At other times, they insert magic wands in the supplicant's mouth or force him to eat substances which are supposed to be healing. From time to time, the medicine men come to their clients and jab magically treated needles into their flesh. The fact that these temple ceremonies may not cure and may even kill the neophyte in no way decreases the people's faith in the medicine man. People thought this was a real thing. So the idea of doing an annual physical was introduced in the 1920s by who else but the American Medical Association. And it's a high stress hurdle, is how she describes it. It's a trial to determine your innocence, your health, or your guilt if you're ill. And the ingredients, I don't know if ingredients is the right word, but the things that are done in an annual physical are not really well defined, even by the Medical Association. It can last 15 minutes. It sort of depends on your doctor and your demographics. It can go on for 2 days, 48 hours if you're wealthy. Insurers often require them. The military automatically subjects its members to them, and the rest of us can be reminded by phone calls or a letter or an email or whatever. And she says that the whole visit sort of resembles a religious ritual. The doctors and the nurses, and even in health facilities for children, they have medical clowns. She says it's kind of like shamans. They're healers. They wear ritual dress. They utter incantations, and they do these performance rites. They're visual rites to make you think something's happening. They involve a confession, where you're grilled about your diet and your exercise and your alcohol and drug use and your sexual behaviors. They're rituals that serve a social function on a continuum, from human sacrifice to maypoles, from a scapegoat to parties held at elections. The medical exam sort of fits into that kind of ritual. Many provide reassurance or guidance at a given stage of life, which is what rituals often do. For example, a bat mitzvah. What are the effects of these medical rituals? They are transgressive. They violate accepted social norms of space and exposure and touch, especially for women. She said they're a lot like fraternity hazings, and a lot like military rituals. She gave the example of one called a daisy chain. You can look it up. It's collective rule breaking to promote solidarity. I'll leave it at that. But doctors invade your privacy. In 1971, women began promoting self-exams of their genitals, and the medical field just completely freaked out. She peripherally touches on childbirth. We have a very heavy-handed over-medicalization of childbirth. In the mid-20th century, women were completely knocked out, and babies were often born with the effects of the drugs. They were sluggish, they had respiratory problems, they had trouble getting their breathing established, and they would use forceps because the women were so out of it, they could not participate in their own labor, and they'd use forceps to grab the baby's head and pull them out, and it caused cranial damage. Also caused pelvic floor damage for women. So then, the pendulum swung, went the other way, and the Lamaze method was promulgated. It was developed by a doctor in France. It was used in Russia, and slowly women began refusing medicated births, and we saw the medical profession, which is greater at the time, was greater than 90% men, they turned childbirth from a natural event to a surgical procedure where women were at the time completely treated like they were going to surgery. Every woman got an enema. Every woman got her pubic hair shaved. Every woman had to lie flat on her back. And everybody had an episiotomy. There was a lot of surgical intervention without asking, is it necessary for this individual woman? And some doctors still do all this, and really none of it is medically necessary at all. Robbie Davis Floyd, an anthropologist, says they are rituals that they're not scientifically justified. There's no physiological purpose, but it sort of establishes the pecking order of the doctor-patient relationship, tells you who's in control, who's in power. There are rituals of domination. Women are treated as unclean, and the process requires absolutely no participation from the woman herself. And these things are created by men to make women feel powerless, to demean, and they also are based on a kind of an attitude that women are dirty, in some way not okay in a normal situation. And they reflect the male medical profession's attitude towards women, for sure. And, a lot of people think this has changed, and it really hasn't. I have a good friend who's a midwife, and she was telling me that she sees more young women these days opting for a fully medicalized birth, or a C-section preferably, than ever before, like, despite all the work that people tried to do to educate. So that's kind of grim. She calls all this rituals of humiliation, after which you're presented with the gift. The doctor gives you a gift, your baby. Women began rejecting these interventions and opting for home births and midwives, and basically challenging the misogyny that was all a part of this. And this extended from birth to hazardous contraceptives, to some extreme surgical procedures like the what's called the Halsted radical mastectomy, which left patients partially crippled. Now, I didn't look this up, but I'm assuming that we're talking about a radical mastectomy that takes a lot a lot of lymph nodes, and also chest tissue, arm tissue, and people end up with really severe edema, lymphedema, and lose range of motion. And they've discovered that these radical approaches are really almost always, not 100% of the time, but almost always unnecessary. Just because of the pressure and losing the money, obstetrics care began to bow to patient demands, but at some time it became more controlling and more intrusive because of the introduction of high tech. They used electronic fetal monitoring, which at the time that they were using it when I had my first child, it had never really been tested on pregnancies. It had been developed by NASA, those external monitors developed by NASA. And sure, they were getting a readout of your baby's heartbeat, but they really didn't know what that meant. And they were making all sorts of care decisions based on data that meant really nothing because it had never been studied. And also, it required the mother to be immobile, which causes trouble in labor. So it automatically led to a higher rate of C-sections, and what you got was a battle of women up against patriarchy and technology, and always keeping in mind that these are generalizations. There's always the person who benefits from this stuff, but the assumption going into the process, everybody needs it, is what's being questioned. The women's health movement had one subset that saw the patriarchy and technology and science and all of it as a monolith based on patriarchal domination, and others wanted to restore scientific rationality, just like calm down to the system that they believe had been contaminated by sexism. But it became clear that medicine was not unbiased and neutral in its social impact. So we have this book that was written in 1975 by a guy called Ivan Illich, called Medical Nemesis, and it documented the negative effects of medical care, including iatrogenic illness. That's illnesses that are actually caused by medical treatment or caused by the drugs you're given. It stated that medical institutions equal a vast system of social control, and they're ruled by an educated elite. And boy, that's for sure. Medicine has the authority to label one man's complaint a legitimate illness, to declare a second man sick, though he himself does not complain, and to refuse a third social recognition of his pain and his disability. Zola, Irving K. Zola, who was a sociologist, was told, his father was told by the doctor to you have problems, you need to switch to a desk job. His father was a blue-collar worker. There was no such thing as a desk job for him. Zola was an avid supporter of the women's health movement. He saw male as well as female patients being required to enact a ritual of deference to the doctor and the bureaucracy, and the bureaucracy he himself was embedded in. Whether it be horizontal or in some awkward placement on one's back or stomach, legs splayed or cramped, or even in front of a desk, the patient is placed in a series of passive dependent and often humiliating positions. And even men of the working class, poor and uneducated, they face this arrogant, condescending, hostile professional class, and there's a real disparity there. There's a power disparity. And so the deduction that they're making is that one function of all this medical hoo-ha is social control, that medical encounters often occur across a huge class gap, a socioeconomic gap in status. And it's usually, not always, but usually an educated white male doctor and a patient in some sort of submissive situation, like a paper gown. These procedures are also common to another system that's dehumanizing, the criminal justice system, which is all about domination and submission. Some doctors defend this as being important to the patient, and I thought that was very interesting. One of the loudest proponents of medical ritual, this Stanford professor, wrote in the New York Times that most patients expect certain procedures when the doctor sees them, and they are quick to perceive when he or she gives these procedures short shrift by, say, placing the stethoscope on top of the gown instead of the skin, doing a cursory prod of the belly, and wrapping up in 30 seconds. Rituals are about transformation, the crossing of a threshold. And in the case of the bedside exam, the transformation is the cementing of the doctor-patient relationship. And so he talked about this later. Well, I would submit to you the ritual of one individual coming to another and telling them things that they would not tell their preacher or rabbi, and then incredibly on top of that, disrobing and allowing touch. I would submit to you that this is a ritual of exceeding importance. He tells a story about a breast cancer patient who went for her treatment to what she judged to be the best cancer center in the world, only to return a few months later to the less prestigious facility where she had been diagnosed. And he asked her, well, why did you come back and get your care here? And he said she was reluctant to say. She said the cancer center was wonderful. It had a beautiful facility, giant atrium, valet parking, a piano that played itself, a concierge that took you around from here to there. She said, but they did not touch my breasts. Now, you and I could argue that they probably did not need to touch her breasts. They had scanned her inside out. They understood her breast cancer at the molecular level. There was no need to touch her. But here the defensive medical ritual verges creepily on the excuse commonly offered by sexual assaulters. She was asking for it. Wow. So these intimacies that are involved are usually not required for care. They're used to heighten the drama. And this is in defense of the ritual, however performative it might be. Some rituals can affect the body and the mind. When you're a child, you kiss their boo-boo when they hurt themselves. Voodoo rituals affect the body and the mind. Placebos, very common. And it's shown that a placebo and an extreme external show of care is more successful than a placebo given in a brusque manner. So if you give it with a cup of tea and you hold their hand and pat their hand and give them sympathy, they're going to do better than if you just say, take this pill. They did an experiment. They told patients that they were being given a placebo and it worked as well as the real drug. And so does that mean that the ritual itself would have a curative effect? Do patients really need a bedside manner, lots of attention, a display of concern, or do Westerners, not impressed with anything less than the trappings of big science, need all the hoo-ha to feel that they're getting treated the best, and to actually, will they respond better medically if that's what they get? Do they need the sterile machinery and the gowns and the stethoscopes, the cut flowers and the music and the friendliness? And would a fake cardboard equipment, would a stage setting of a doctor's office be just as effective? If medical ritual is for the purpose of social support, why does it have to be so expensive and so stressful and so demanding? So in chapter 3, we talk about the veneer of science. Medicine gets its authority and its justification for charging you because it claims it's based on science. And it's considered better than relying on religion because there's no need to put your trust in something without some evidence that it should be reproducible and shown to work. It's not dependent on faith, and therefore a certain portion of the population puts all of its trust in medicine because it's evidence-based, or so they think. It's scientifically proven. Studies show. People love to talk about that. And she goes, well, we really like this, but is it true? The medium has long claimed scientific integrity and defended its hegemony. Medicine has, but proactively defending against pseudoscience alternatives is something that the medical field has really dedicated itself to. And the question begs to be asked, why do they feel so threatened? So a century ago, rules went into place about professional training for doctors and licensing, outlawing alternative practitioners like midwives, and marginalizing homeopathy. In the 1950s, the American Cancer Society had a committee on quackery. That was actually the name of it. And they changed it to the Committee on Unproven Methods when they wanted to sound a little bit more formal. So the names changing indicate a gradual acceptance of the unconventional. Today, the Cancer Society has a committee on complementary and alternative medicine. The evolving vocabulary reflects a sea change underway throughout medicine. In the last few years, the term alternative, suggesting something done instead of conventional medicine, has given way to complementary, a therapy done along with mainstream treatment. Both words may ultimately be replaced by integrative medicine, the use of techniques like acupuncture, massage, herbal treatments, and meditation in regular medical practice. How scientific is so-called scientific medicine? As the demands for solid proof for the efficacy of medical treatment arose, more and more familiar procedures fell short. So things that we were told we ought to do because they are so preventative and so worthwhile, when they really got investigated, maybe not so much. In 1974, mathematician David Eddy researched medical decision trees. Those are like flowcharts, what is your symptom? Is it here or here? If it's here, then ask this question. If you ask this question, you go down to the next one. Those sort of flow charts of treatment, doctors rely heavily on those. And the research behind them was investigated, and it was discovered that many, like certain mammograms and ocular hypertension treatments that were prescribed, had few or no controlled studies at all. There was no solid evidence to back up why people were being told they had to do them. And often, recipients of these treatments ended up worse off than they were when they started. So she said, well, that if there wasn't sufficient information to develop a decision tree, what in the world were physicians basing their decisions on? I then realized that medical decision making was not built on a bedrock of evidence or formal analysis, but was really standing on jello, and they do not want you to know that. This raised the question, had medicine ever been evidence-based, or was it eminence-based? Most medical screening fail the evidence-based test. All these screening tests. Mammograms, for example, the conventional wisdom. Now, I have to read this because I feel like that's the one that people are going to be the most sensitive about. Conventional wisdom, tirelessly repeated by the Susan G. Komen Foundation, was that early detection through annual mammography could significantly increase the 5-year survival rate from breast cancer. But repeated, huge, often international studies showed no significant decline in breast cancer mortality that could be attributed to routine mammographic screening. True, any woman whose cancer's been detected through screening might claim to have been saved by the intervention, but the likelihood was that the spot on her mammogram would never have developed into full-blown cancer. What screening was finding and doctors were treating were often slow-growing or inactive tumor sites, or even non-invasive conditions. And treating precancers and non-cancers may seem like a commendable excess of caution, except the treatments themselves, surgery, chemotherapy, and radiation, entail their own considerable risks. Disturbingly enough, breast biopsies are themselves a risk factor for cancer and can seed adjacent tissue with cancer cells. And I won't torture you with cancer screenings, colonoscopy screenings. One study found that half the men over 66 being treated for prostate cancer are unlikely, in general, to live long enough to die from prostate cancer itself. They will, however, live long enough to suffer from the adverse consequences of their treatment. So in this discussion, she also includes hormone therapy, which is a real sensitive subject. And I had a really good friend who tortured herself about estrogen creams and getting pills from the doctor and alternative solutions and this and that, and just tortured herself about what she was going to do when she was going through menopause, because she was having night sweats and hot flashes and everything. And she asked me, what do you do, Helen? What do you do for it? I said, I don't know. I just suffer through it. It'll go away soon enough. I mean, that's what menopause does. The symptoms end and then it's over. A lot of the treatments for it simply prolong the agony or delaying the inevitable. And I just figured I'd tough it out and put up with it, and eventually things would settle down. I tend to be less eager to jump into treatments. So there's a wide variety of the extent of an annual physical, from a hospitalization that includes scans and MRIs and EKGs and lab tests, or you can go to the doctor and they'll take your blood pressure and do a vision test and search for open lesions, she said. Nevertheless, in the United States, the cost accrued to the medical field from annual exams is over $10 billion a year. They make $10 billion a year on it. And women's annual exams are not always voluntary because they're required for contraception. They're often traumatic because of the detailed attention to your breasts and your genitals, which mimic sexual encounters, involve intimate touching, and can often be not good. They now know that these tests, these exams, all this interference really doesn't save lives at all. And this doctor justifies it by saying it's what I taught and it's what patients have been taught to expect, although he acknowledged that he would be hard-pressed to give a scientific justification for all of the testing that they do. So we need to replace bad science with good science that includes statistical analysis and acknowledges that the patient is a human being. It's a big market for these comprehensive exams, and if you're rich, they make a 2-day-long hospital visit kind of into a spa vacation. 22% of Fortune 500 CEOs get executive exams. No, 22% of Fortune 500 companies give their executives exams for, annual testing. But what good does it do? And the review that they did said, well, not much. And for all the reasons that have been listed here, frequency of false positive, dangers of the tests themselves, such as radiation, and the unlikelihood of finding a problem in a still treatable stage. It just doesn't happen all that much to justify, $10 billion industry. So I'm going to stop here because we've already gone for an hour, and then we'll go back and pull the medical field apart a little bit more. It's kind of fun. And I hope you're enjoying this. I wish I could do true justice to her sense of humor. She's so snarky. It's really funny. But anyway, I'll end here and I'll be back with part 2 in a minute. So, slung the foil.